This week on Act Out, an important look at the ongoing steamroller of U.S. empire, in particular in Venezuela. Yeah, remember Venezuela? Dan Kovalik joins us to look behind the propaganda and into the deep and long history of U.S. terrorism in Venezuela and beyond. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Right off the bat today, I want to go ahead and dive into some new old news. So, remember Venezuela? Remember the horrific humanitarian crisis we just couldn't stop talking about? So much so that billionaires had concerts and even Angelina Jolie visited. Yeah, what happened to that? Well, after multiple failed coup attempts, the most recent of which was just last week, the cameras just slowly backed away from Venezuela, hoping that no one would notice how absolutely stupid not only the US looks, but their propaganda machine vis-a-vis corporate media. And fortunately for them, the majority of Americans have goldfish-like memories that only bolster the empire's agenda of etch-a-sketch war and regime change. Which is why it's so important to combat that rolling infotainment cycle, not only with legitimate news, but updates that remind us of the ongoing terrorism our government is engaged in. Here to dive into that with regards to Venezuela is Dan Kovalik, human rights lawyer and author of several books, most recently, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, How the U.S. is Orchestrating a Coup for Oil. Take a look.
I think we can't assume that people, particularly Americans, understand the history of U.S. imperial aggression in Latin America in particular. One would think you could take that for granted, but you can't. People don't even know about the wars in Central America in the 80s, which of course continue to reverberate today in the migrant, issue. People think the migrants just show up out of thin air and don't understand, the cruel policies that made their countries unlivable. And so I felt like people needed to know that and understand.
And the book also rightfully paints Americans as oftentimes useful idiots in allowing these lies to perpetuate. I mean, not many Americans would know about the massacre in South Korea that you mentioned. Do you think that this sort of blind, jingoistic nationalism is something that we can address? I mean, particularly with things like Bolton blatantly lying on television saying, "Oh yeah, no, we're doing it because of the oil."
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I saw recently an article entitled that the new generation does not presume American innocence. And I think with the millennial generation, it's my experience that while they don't have a huge context about American imperialism, they're open to learning it. That is, they're more or less a blank slate. They don't learn much history at all in school, for good or for ill. And so they're willing to learn about it. Like, for example, the first thing I teach in my class is about the war in Vietnam. They know there was a war in Vietnam. They know it was, catastrophic. They know it, there were people with flowers in their hair and hippies and what, but they don't understand why or what happened. And when they read about the details, the cruel details, the millions of people killed, the cruel way in which they were killed, women and children being targeted, they're like, oh, wait a second. That's pretty bad, and so I think there is an ability to reach people, but it's an effort to do it because the problem is that the mainstream media is not open to hearing these things. You have to do things like we're doing. It's a ground game all the time to get the word out. So.
Absolutely. And the other side of that is that, which you also address in the book, where you talk about, we're 5% of the population, but we use a quarter of the oil, the aluminum, etc. So this isn't just about recognizing our imperialism. It's about fundamentally shifting the way that we live in order to allow these countries to have their own autonomy and self-determination.
Yes. And I think that is a hard pill for Americans to swallow that, we live so well, or many of us do. Obviously, less and less of us are living well, and we have to acknowledge that too. But to the extent those of us who do live well do so, we do so on the backs of other people. And all the time, news comes out. Just for example, chocolate. It turns out probably 10% of the chocolate in the international market is cacao is picked. Cacao, sorry, is picked by child slaves. And you can go down the line with that. Even like things that we think are good, like solar energy. A lot of the minerals used to make, solar panels come from very oppressed labor, including child labor. And the U.S. has been able to create those types of oppressive markets by invading other countries, by preventing progressive governments from coming to power. Or in the case of like the Congo, for example, preventing any functioning government from coming to power. And so we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that whether we like it or not, we're part of a very cruel system.
That is a very hard pill to swallow. And but as you noted, not all of us in the United States live that way. It's the richest country in the world, but as more people living in poverty, around 40 million, than Venezuela has people,
Right.
which is also what you point out. So I'm sort of in that vein. You talk about how people come together in Venezuela to work through, for instance, the electricity outages, which were perpetrated by the U.S. And though I've never been to Venezuela, something in the book that there was a particular line that really resonated with me that reminded me of my time in Cuba. You wrote, "In the U.S., we have everything, but at the same time, nothing. While in Venezuela, you have nothing, but at the same time, everything." Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and having been to Cuba, you understand what that means, and that is that a lot of times when you do have material plenty, and your life is focused on that plenty and gathering more, it creates a spiritual deadening. Particularly the way our society is organized, it's very atomistic. Again, people have for those of us who have means, we all have our own car or two cars. We all have our own big house. We all have all the mechanisms we need in that house to wash our laundry, etc. That is to say, those things therefore cut us off from other people. We feel we don't need other people because we're self-functioning in that way. In places like Cuba, Venezuela, where it would be a dream for most people to have such things, you have to depend on your neighbors, particularly when the electricity goes out. You can't get water. You may have a neighbor who has their own electrical generator, and you have to go to that person to get electricity or to get water. It creates social bonds, even amongst people of different political views. I was talking to one of my friends when I was there in April named Tulio, and he lives in a working class community, which has, pro-Maduro people, anti-Maduro people. And he said, when the lights went out, none of that mattered. People took care of each other. I do wonder if the U.S., I guess only speaking for my own city, Pittsburgh, if the same thing happened here, how much people would take care of each other. Or if they would just lock their doors and take care of themselves, So anyways, that's what I mean. There's a spirituality about that in these countries where it's just assumed you take care of people. And so something has been lost in this society that I think those societies still have and that we can learn from,
Yeah, and another thing that you talk about is how Venezuela has done obviously a lot for their own people, but also for neighboring countries as well. And to me, this is another reason why the U.S. hates them. Right? It's the threat of the good example. And I love that you asked the question as well that if we can use a blackout as excuse for regime change in Venezuela, why not Puerto Rico? Yeah, so I think that I mean, talk a little bit about that Venezuela maintains such. I mean, you can even just look at the fact that Guaido has not been, arrested, and what would happen if somebody tried to overthrow Trump? I mean, would they still be walking around? I mean, talk about the sort of like moral high ground that Venezuela exists on compared to us with regards not just to their own country but to neighboring countries and the region.
Yeah, well, as you know, Guaido continues to walk around. If he were in the U.S., if he were a U.S. citizen and he was claiming not only to be president, but meeting with foreign dignitaries as president, which is in violation of an old law called the Logan Act, and even worse, taking U.S. revenue for himself, which is what's happening. I mean, he's taking Venezuelan revenue that's been seized by the U.S., right? If someone was doing that in the U.S., they would be arrested for treason. And no one would sympathize with that person, right? Um, you know, Meanwhile, we have to remember, and as I mentioned in the book, the 2002 coup against Chavez, in which he was kidnapped and taken to a military base for a couple days. People think he was tortured, by the way. Um, he came back and he ended up giving amnesty to all the people who participated in that coup. Again, can you imagine that you or I, we kidnapped Donald Trump? I'm afraid to even say it in public, right? I'll be arrested for merely expressing the possibility of this. And, we're caught alive. What would be done to us?
Yeah.
We would be in Guantanamo.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, forgiveness that country, that government has shown to people who've done awful things to other Venezuelans, again, to Chavez and his associates. It's pretty incredible.
We've seen basically with regards to Brazil and Colombia and around Latin America, there have sort of been these dominoes that have fallen. What is it that and of course Venezuela has been a big supporter of autonomy and self-determination in the region. How do you think it is that Venezuela has been able to maintain? Do you think it is that sort of that culture, or how has that domino not fallen?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because they have survived where many others have not. You look at Chile in 1973, which had the coup by Pinochet, who was in the ranks of the military, we have to remember, and was loyal for a time. And you've seen some attempts against Maduro, even recently in the last couple of days, but apparently by some people in the military. What makes it different? First of all, I think that you have a revolution that did have many good years prior to having more trying years. So really, between 1999 when Chavez took office as president and about 2015, while there were problems certainly, year after year they were having huge gains against poverty. They were increasing people's calorie count, getting food to people, etc., getting education to people. So they had enough years of good gains that people remember that and continue to be loyal to that, even though it's tough times now. But those same people realize why it's tough times, and they know who's turning the screws, and that's the United States with the sanctions, right? When you compare to Chile, which only lasted a few years, right? And really the U.S. hammered them so quickly and fiercely. So that's one reason. The other, I think you do have more loyalty in the ranks of the military after the 2002 coup, because the one thing Chavez did do is he made sure he had loyalists in the military. And let's remember, Chavez was a military guy himself. And so I think that has helped quite a bit. But I think also the Venezuelans, again, after now 20 years of the Bolivarian Revolution, understand what's at stake, not just for them, but for the rest of the region. They know this is a battle for Latin America. Really, it's a battle for humanity.
And you talk a lot about media coverage. I mean, the plot to overthrow Venezuela. This is the manufactured consent that we've seen over and over and over again with regards to the media. And I also thought it was interesting, just reading your book and then realizing as I was reading it, wow, I haven't heard that much about Venezuela recently. It's like all of a sudden, oh, I guess that humanitarian crisis is over and finished with, and we've moved on. But I think it's interesting that so much of that comes down to language. We talked about the corporate media would say the dictator Maduro, but it was, President Macron. They're both presidents that were democratically elected. And according to international election observers, most democratically elected president possibly ever because of the way that elections are structured in Venezuela.
Yeah, no, those are the interesting things to look at. Maduro's government is a regime, for example. Trump's government, which is more nasty than any other, is a government. As bad as it is, it's never a regime. You'll never hear the New York Times talk about the Trump regime, right? That word is only given to those who we don't like and don't think well of. And as you say, NPR, for example, here, National Public Radio, which it has a new tagline. It says, "This is the sound of a free press." Which, by the way, if you have to say it's the sound of a free press, it's probably not. But yeah, they will say the dictator or the strong man or whatever, Maduro, right? As if we can't decide that for ourselves. They claim to do that. They claim to give you the facts and let you make up your mind, but they really don't do that because they immediately jump and tell you you're supposed to view him as a dictator. Meanwhile, Duque, the president of Colombia, who has paramilitary forces that have killed over 150 social leaders in the past year. He's a president. He's not a dictator. And so that's how the propaganda system works. So there's probably three ways. One, they use this kind of Orwellian language and doublespeak. And again, apply certain labels to get you to think a certain way. Two, they, frankly, at times manufacture facts. So CNN claimed, for example, that the Maduro forces set two of those aid trucks on fire. And it turned out, in fact, it was opposition people who did that. We didn't learn that from the mainstream press for 2 weeks, even though people like Max Blumenthal, who were on the ground at the time, were reporting it right away, right? So many times they're willing to fabricate lies, exaggerate things. But then the third thing they do is they obsess on problems of the targeted country like Venezuela. So all countries have problems, right? But if you hear about the problems of any country every day, and that's all you hear about, it will generate in your mind, the willingness to go along with regime change. So, for example, I'll often give a talk, and if there's an opposition person in the room, they'll say, there are people eating out of garbage dumpsters in Venezuela. We have to do something about it. Well, first of all, we know that some of the photos of people doing that were not real, or they were staged or whatever. But I'm going to assume, for the purposes of argument, that there are people eating out of dumpsters in Venezuela. And the reason I will believe that is because there's people eating out of dumpsters in the U.S. And there are tent cities in almost every major city in the U.S. because of the huge homelessness problem. If someone wanted regime change in the U.S., they could just show those pictures every day and those videos every day. Oh, there's people eating out of dumpsters in Pittsburgh. We have to change the government. Again, like, if you step back for 1 minute, you realize, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's that obsessive coverage of this country rather than that country. Again, rather than, let's just say, neighboring Colombia, that has more internally displaced people than any country on earth at about 8 million, that has almost 6 million Colombians living in Venezuela who fled violence in their country, right? We're not going to focus on that. We're going to only focus on people leaving Venezuela, even though, by the way, many of them are Colombians returning home, but we won't tell you that either. So those are the ways in which we're propagandized. And it's the most effective propaganda system ever devised. And the reason is because people don't see it as propaganda. Most propaganda systems have been so jingoistic as to be people knew that, okay, yeah, I hear you, but, I know it's bullshit, right? But again, people, when they listen to NPR, they believe it's the sound of a free press. When they read the New York Times, they believe it's all the news fit to print. That's the problem. And when you believe those things, almost like a religion, then you'll fall for anything that they tell you.
And of course, as you point out in your book, like even though these are problems that might I mean, you don't mention the dumpster thing, but that of course there are problems in Venezuela, just like there are problems anywhere. But Venezuela is actually addressing them, like actively, even though we've literally tied their hands with regards to what they can effectively do to help their own people. But you mentioned, Chavez and Maduro, the things, the programs, and like the housing initiatives that have been put forward, whereas we're not doing anything about our tent cities. We're not doing anything. I mean, if anything, it's just caused an increase in the overt rise of fascism in the United States, as opposed to actually trying to do something about the homelessness issue and the poverty issue in our country.
No, exactly. So, for example, Venezuela has Medicare for all. They have free nationalized health care. That's something that we're desperate for. That Bernie Sanders is promising is almost pie in the sky because no one thinks he's really going to be elected, right? Meanwhile, you raise the 10 cities. Venezuela was just commended by the UN for being one of the few countries on earth that guarantees the right to housing, and they've built 2.5 million housing units in recent years. So you assume a family of 4 in each unit, which is, by the way, pretty conservative, probably. 4 times 2.5 is 10. That's 10 million people housed in a country of 30 million. Pretty impressive. And as you say, what are we doing in this country, in famed cities like San Francisco that have teachers living in cars, right? We're doing nothing. Seattle, I was visiting recently. I used to live in Seattle. Used to like that city, used to think it was a beautiful, liberal, kind of, crunchy city. It's now really hard to be in that city and see people at the fancy Starbucks Reserve restaurants. I don't know if you've ever seen these. These are high-end Starbucks where you can have your own tasting room and all this. And then there's homeless people right outside, right? It's a disaster. And it's getting worse. So as you say, Venezuela, even in the face of these deadly sanctions, and they are deadly, we should mention that there was a recent report by Mark Weisenbrot and Jeffrey Sachs that estimated that sanctions since August of 2017 alone have killed over 40,000 people. And they estimate more than 40,000 will die this year due to the sanctions. Despite such deadly sanctions, they continue to build homes. They continue to provide food through the CLAP program. And what is the U.S. doing? It is now saying it's going to sanction the CLAP program to prevent people from eating. So,
For more on Dan's work, follow him on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik and find his book, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, online. And that will almost do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. But before we close out today, a little note, an apt consideration on our so-called Independence Day.
This is not a happy birthday. No, this day is a hallowed pride in a long-standing genocide, this nationalist high made to conquer, divide, glittering smokescreens that just barely hide the fact that America is not great. And it never was. For all wasn't meant to be for all, but for some. So why should you, why should I put our hands over hearts and pledge allegiance to the legions still breaking the broken? Old wounds aren't closing. Why saddle your soul with the empire's ode? We're owed more. And we owe more. We owe more to the early graves that were dug by our capitalist crusades. We owe more to the fighters and builders who've been whitewashed from history. We owe more to the kids coming up, growing up in smoke-filled air and poisoned soil. We owe our toil to more than a flimsy facade of freedom. And we likewise are owed more than a nation named, a constitution framed without us. Yes, the idea of America is not great either. And wait, just please pause, because pontificating platitudes just feed aggro attitudes. The theorizing keeps us from realizing that we can do better than a crusty old constitution, a resolution of, for, and by white land-owning men, 6% of the population back then, and still today. It remains a pedestaled holy grail that we fail to see past the future of what we could be, beyond the American dream. Because inside these walls of an empire dying, we can keep rising, we can aim higher than just getting by, and we can steal hope from a hangman's white rope. We can build dignity in the halls of a capitalist divinity. We can move past the blame game and masturbatory shame, the nihilistic, masochistic fuck it all. No, feel with me. Wrap your shame in red, white, and blue. Set it on fire so that the feel-good warm pyre can bring us together to fight and to build. Let's make a sparkler out of our guilt and burn it like rites of passage. Yes, let's now move past this. Because we children of the empire are marked by our past, and the last thing we need is a solemn silence for all of those deeds. A flag-waving passive devoid of the passion of fighting for liberation liberates oneself. Yeah, I want to be free, and my will to freedom is tied right to yours, bleeds over borders. Cue the requiem chorus for the empire's creed. It's the only independence you should raise a glass to, smashing the system in your mind and be free. Free to be un-American. A child of empire that won't sit on sidelines but stands on the front lines with hope and dignity, a human humility, a resolute if not shaky stability, the solidarity beyond a fake unity, not for America, but for people and planet. Happy Independence Day. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and said my shove. I'm